Thank you very much, Serge, and delighted to be with you. And we only have an hour, which for a speaker like Maurice-Gourdault Montagne is barely enough to do an introduction. But we will be sharp and efficient, and I'm sure the ambassador will give us much food for thought. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. We are very lucky to have the former ambassador to Japan, to China, to Germany, to the UK, and also President Chirac's former diplomatic advisor, which gives the ambassador both a global picture and an Asian picture, which is, of course, the main purpose of the Asia Society and its France chapter. Ambassador, good morning or good afternoon, and let me start with situation around Ukraine. We're almost 2 months into this war, this conflict. The casualties are massive for both Ukrainian and Russian armies. And the May 9th commemorative day in Moscow was certainly not a celebration day. A few weeks ago, I think you said in an interview that the West perhaps should take the initiative vis-à-vis President Vladimir Putin before he possibly escalates into the use of chemical, nuclear weapons or other means. We are facing with a Russian leader who is determined to make history. For the time being, it hasn't been in a very positive way, but this is somebody who is working on his legacy, you could say. Let me just ask you first, and perhaps you can elaborate on this thinking. But how do you see the impacts of Finland and Sweden applying for NATO membership? How do you see the increase of Western and European help to Ukraine? Is this us escalating as opposed to Russia escalating? And do we have a sort of a third way between Mr. Putin's way and the current sort of move, which is very much the West rallying, but the others staying on the sidelines? When I say the others, and we'll come to Asian countries, of course, in more details, but the others being China, India, many countries of the developing world. And at the moment, I see it as as a sort of a line, a division between the West and the rest. Would you agree with this preliminary statement?
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this introductory question, which is very comprehensive, I would say. You just reminded that I had written, it was more than 1 month ago, that one should seek peace first and foremost. But the truth is that we are, I would say, settling in the war. Settling in the war with, you said the word, escalation to defend Ukraine, which is the victim of an aggression by Russia, and which is, I would say, enjoying the support by the West. The West, being said as a whole, the West, it's the US and it's Europe. There is a unity of the West regarding sanctions, though one sees already that things are not such easy, in particular because of energy, and we know all of that, oil and gas. On oil, when it's about ready to stop imports of oil from Russia, on gas, it's very difficult for Germany. It's because it's more than half of its imports of gas, and the whole of the project of Germany in the next 10 years in its transition mix of energy is that gas must play the first part, whereas other countries like France want nuclear to play the first part in the energetic power generation. We have Central European countries like Slovakia and Hungary, and so which are depending totally on Russia. So we have divides within Europe. We have been united to export and deliver weapons, and we are still in the process of escalation of delivering weapons as we are implementing decisions which were made in the last weeks regarding heavy weapons, which means tanks, which means drones, which means also guns regarding the French. The French are exporting guns which are higher standard ones, which are shooting 40 kilometers far. So we don't see yet the effects of that. The point is that the more we settle in the more we settle in the war, the more we shall face risks of shifting the situation, having some bombings in one place or another, having maybe some crossing of the border of Russia. It could happen as well. So one side, we want to help the Ukrainians resist and, if possible, get rid of the Russian troops out of Ukraine. On the other side, we think, some of us in Europe think differently from others. And you see at the moment, we attend at the moment something which is quite new, which goes back to last week, which is that France, Germany and Italy are a bit different in their expression compared to other ones. You have the Poles, you have in strong support to the Ukrainians because they are like cousin or brothers. There are Central European countries. You have, as you said, countries like Sweden and Finland, who have been neutral. Finland since 1941, after this victory on the Red Army, and after a very difficult endeavor to become completely independent, but they were neutralized actually. And they have these long borders of 1,300 kilometers and up to Murmansk, actually, which is the place where you have this nuclear submarine of Russia, where you have lots of storage of armaments of Russia. Now there will be a long border. And there is Sweden. Sweden, I am even more, I would say, surprised when I look at Sweden, because Sweden has been neutral for the last 250 years, even more. And after the Napoleonic Wars in 1809, they decided to be neutral. And there were some arrangements with the EU when they became members of the EU in 1995. And they are part of, I would say, all the forums in which foreign defense policy is discussed. It shows a lot about the fear, the perception of the threats all these countries have. In the first front line, these are the Baltic countries, former Soviet republics. Then you have the Central European countries, and you have now these countries. One is a neighboring country, and the other one is a bit remote. So it shows the emotion, it shows the changes in internal politics of these countries. So it's clear in those countries. In Germany, it's even more difficult. It's even more difficult. You have one Germany against the other one, I would say. There were petitions launched by experts on Russia who said, we must absolutely get rid of Russia, punish Putin, and it was close to the language used by American officials, President Biden, who said that Putin shouldn't stay in power in the way he has acted. There are others in Germany who are still on the path of what has been done in the last 40 years, which is Wandel durch Handeln, which is in Germany, as you know, change through trade. And they stick very much to that position, and they think that any escalation of the war would be disastrous. So we have the three countries, which are now, I would say, different from the Central European countries, and Germany in between. We have France. President Macron in the European Parliament, by his first speech, said, we must now be ready to prepare peace. He said, Putin must not be humiliated. Maybe the expression is not appropriate because it's not a matter of humiliation. It's the matter of setting a certain atmosphere, preparing the way, paving the way to have a negotiation around the table. Draghi, president of the Italian Council, went to the US, and after his talks with President Biden said, we need now to prepare peace. Yes, we must support Ukraine, but prepare peace. And there are the Germans, Scholz himself, after a conversation with President Putin, who said, we must prepare peace. So we are now on a Europe which is supporting strongly and fiercely Ukraine, and a Europe which is now taking into account what the future might be. And I think this will continue as we are still in the war. We would like, certain in France and in Europe, would like to hear from the Americans themselves the word peace. There is only one hint at it, which was done by President Biden last week. He was talking in front of a foundation in Minnesota, I think. And he said, there must be an exit to Putin. I wonder what it could be. I try to figure out what it could be. But it doesn't mean that officially there is an attempt from the US to work on that path. I said that for a single reason. We have Mr. Putin in front of us, who has shown the way he works, the way he acts. And we are all appalled by what we've seen, by what we have attended. But Putin is there. Putin is the product of a system which is still the Soviet system. We have an Homo Sovieticus in front of us. This Homo Sovieticus has still in mind the Cold War. And for him, the only country with whom the Russians want to talk are the Americans. So far, the Europeans, yes, they exist, but they are divided, they know that, even if they have some common actions. They want to talk with the Americans. And so far, there were only 2 phone talks, one between the defense secretary of the US, General Austin, and Minister for Defense Shoigu in Russia, which had no results. And there was no conversation between President Putin and President Biden. So one day, when we have to come to that point, the view we have in France is that the system as it is in Russia is as it is. I hear here or there people saying, oh yes, we must re-educate the Russians. We shall not re-educate the Russians. They are as they are. They are the product of their history and their geography. We are all the products of our history and geography. The Europeans have certain interests they share with the Americans. We share values, not always the same. We share the value of freedom, first and foremost, freedom of expression, freedom of entrepreneurship, and all that. Freedom of thought, freedom of religion. But when we talk about the state, for instance, it's very different. When we talk about the law, it's very different. Habeas corpus is something which exists in Britain and the US, which doesn't exist on the continent in Europe. So we are not totally overlapping, and our geographical interests are not totally overlapping with the ones of the Americans. So we shall have to work on peace one day. And I come now to what you said, the last point you mentioned, which is how are we perceived by the rest of the world? That's the question, because we are not alone. We are in a globalized world, which we have developed ourselves. We were among the leaders of that world. The thing is, if we look very closely, that there is a diplomatic rupture, apart of whatever is happening in the supply chains, and we shall come back maybe on it. But there is a diplomatic rupture when we see the votes at the UN, at the Security Council once, at the General Assembly second, when we see that apart from certain supporters of the West, clients of the Americans, clients of the Europeans, I will put it like that, major countries, India, in countries in the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, Senegal, for instance, abstained. They abstained. That's the first time. So, in fact, let's be very well aware that this conflict, which is touching us, the Europeans, over Ukrainians, against the Russians, and the US being there, we are in a way withdrawing on ourselves. It's a conflict by white people against white people, and the hegemony of the Western world is losing weight. Our interests are losing weight. There are circuits of economy and finance which are set up apart from whatever we've decided regarding sanctions. So these are the new fractures of the world when you see that, for instance, the Turks have decided that they would welcome Russian tourists and they will be allowed to pay rubles during their vacations and holidays. So certain systems are set up. When you see that it was denied afterwards, but that some deliveries of oil to China could be paid in yuan to Saudi Arabia. It shows that there are people thinking of that. So maybe I would say the predominance of our currencies, the predominance of our economic system, which is still very strong, it's not yet the end, of course not, but could be hit by whatever is happening through what we attend at the moment with this Ukraine war.
No, I certainly take your point about Putin wanting to have a dialogue with the US president. That probably won't be possible for domestic political reasons in the United States, with a current situation which is pretty shaky ahead of the midterm elections, and the fact Americans do not want their country to be the policeman of the world anymore, and so Biden has been sort of acting as a helper to the Europeans, but certainly doesn't want to appear as leading the West. That's my impression. As for the former neutral countries, I mean, they are the ones really that feel threatened, scared. Finland, Sweden, the Baltic states, and as well as the Eastern European countries that have been at the forefront of this war. Let me turn to something you've said very interestingly in another interview, and this has to do with Jacques Chirac, who you served for many years. When President Chirac left office, a number of people close to him said that he was going to be seen as a visionary, a man who had studied multipolarity and perhaps had been prescient about this multipolar world, recognizing Russia as a pole, China as a pole, no doubt, the United States as a pole, and today it seems this is really happening. This is not a surprise to any of us around this table, but it seems to be a surprise in some circles. And I wonder how you would use the Chirac philosophy in analyzing this today's situation, and particularly when it comes to Russia. But then I'll come to China in a few minutes, if I may.
Yes, that's a key question, actually. Chirac was talking very often of a multipolar world, which was his idea that, yes, the US, the United States had won, and the West had won over communism. Had won over communism in 1990 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there was then a certain hubris of our democracies. Oh, everything will go on like that, and we don't need to set up anything in the new situation, which was very dangerous. And that was the idea of Chirac. This multiple world has to organize itself. It has to organize itself because there was a vacuum in the collective security. We had a system of collective security, which was in fact the balance of terror, which had been set up so that everyone was looking at the other before undertaking any action, preventive action or whatever. And there was this red line phone, which was in fact the symbol to that. And in 1990, everything crumbled. There was nothing more. And we thought that things would go on as if nothing had happened. Actually, this vacuum was disastrous. It was disastrous because we had no conventional agreement on conventional arms. no more agreement on intermediary. No, there is, from all the agreements signed during the Cold War, there is only one which is left, which will end in 2024. This is the New START agreement on certain middle-range missiles. So we have to rebuild some collective security system, including not only Russia and the US and Europe, but as well many other countries who have long-range missiles. Why not with China? Why not with Iran? Why not with Turkey? So these are things which have to be taken into account. This multipolar world must be organized on the plan of security. There is another point which was very much in the mind of Chirac, which was the UN, United Nations. Chirac had the feeling that the United Nations, as they were functioning according to the charter which had been signed after the Second World War and gave, I would say, the preeminence to the countries who were victorious on the Nazi Germany and on Japan at the time. This UN system needed some re-legitimation. Because if we look at the Security Council, of course, with 2 European countries, France and Britain, and the 3 other ones who are permanent members, the whole 5 together, the 10 other ones who are renewed every 2 years. So Chirac thought it's not enough. So we have to work on it. That's the time we launched the idea that Japan could come in, that Germany should be in, that Brazil should be in, India as well, with, of course, the counterpart of it, which is that the commitment of these countries for peace or war, which is the ultimate responsibility of the permanent member of Security Council, should be taken into account. This didn't work because you can imagine that our Chinese friends never accepted that Japan would be in, and I wonder, the Germans, the Italians wanted, and so on. So the debate is open. And one day, if we want this multipolar world to be organized, we shall have to set up a new system of that kind. Collective security, diplomatic way of tackling peace and war issues. So far, everything is blocked. And we see that there are always the China and Russia together, and on the other side, the P3, as we call it, US, France, and Britain, when it works. So the system doesn't work as it is.
I would like to come to public opinions in both Russia and China. It seems the Russians have been behind Putin. They feel threatened, surrounded. They are at the same time extremely resilient. But yesterday, or a couple of days ago, there was the feeling that perhaps the Russian media were prepared to acknowledge the fact Russia was actually isolated, and that the West was rallying behind Ukraine. That's for the Russians. For the Chinese, of course, they've got quite a few things on their plate at the moment, particularly the leadership, and we'll come to that a bit later. But the narrative that has been offered to them in the Chinese media has been, by and large, we are supporting the Russia, but we're also giving space to the Ukrainian view. For example, Xinhua News Agency offered 2 interviews with the 2 foreign ministers of Russia and of Ukraine. That was a bit surprising, but I wonder how you feel about this, especially as, you know, of course, the February 4th joint communique between Russia and China is considered as a stepping stone for this very close partnership. And we're not talking about an alliance, but certainly a close friendship, a friendship without limits. And I wonder, you know, how the Chinese leadership will come out of this narrative. But meanwhile, public opinions do have a lot of importance in both cases of Russia and China, and the idea of that you stressed of the pride of both nations and the history, and of course, in the case of China, there are many other issues, but because we're having this war in Ukraine at the moment, obviously there are many issues that relates to Russian history and perhaps the Soviet Union as well. But I'd like to hear your views about all this, if I may.
This is what you are talking about at the moment, and the question you raise are actually the key questions of the future. Major powers, neighboring powers, very close to each other, because the more the West was not taken into account what the Russians wanted, even as an excuse or something, but we cut off all the channels of communications with the Russians in the last years, one after another. So the more we did that, the more the Russians went to the Chinese power, get together. And we can wonder, because you mentioned history. If we look back in history, China and Russia are not particularly friendly countries. Even at the time of communism, there were lots of crises. There were Russians, Soviets expelled from Russia. I remember having talked with my Russian colleague in Beijing on the issue. These were not good memories. And still now there is this understanding between the two countries for obvious reasons. Even on the Chinese side, I heard some Chinese friends telling me, Russia is a colonial country who took some territories from us. We shall reclaim one day. So this is in the back mind, I would say, of the people. Still, they are together. You mentioned the endless cooperation, which was stated, reaffirmed at the beginning of the Olympic Games, where Mr. Putin decided to go and to be welcomed by Xi Jinping. A few months after, things are different. China is in between, and as we know China, and there are plenty of experts of China here around me and in the audience, so I will be very humble and very cautious on what I say. But the truth is that for the Chinese power, the major issue is to stay in power and to stabilize the power. We have a major event, which is the 20th Congress. And for everyone who has lived in China, the plenum every year, and the plenum of the party, and the Congress every 5 years is the key moment. Renewal of the permanent committee, renewal of the Politburo, and so on and so forth. So the question of stabilization is important. The COVID has hit China, is hitting China again. China needs a strong economy. We see that the growth in China will be only 5.5, something around 5.5, not exactly what has been expected. I read yesterday some articles telling that unemployment amongst the youth is expanding, which is the worst thing, because when you're unemployed, you have nothing to do, and it's very difficult to control. So the thing is that China needs to keep up the trade with its major partners, which are on the one side, the US, which represent about 7 times the trade they have with Russia, and with the European Union, which represent 10 times the trade they have with Russia. So these are facts. And as we know, our Chinese partners, the Chinese government is dealing with facts. So what is true is that there are other facts which are adding to that. There is the official position by Chinese government, which is Russia is there, this is an ally, we support Russia. Though ally is not used as such, but we support the partner Russia. But if we look in other directions, there was this report by a former Chinese ambassador to Ukraine, Gao Yushan, who recently exposed very clearly that Russia's results, Russia's system is a failure. They couldn't take over properly from the Soviets. They didn't create anything. And regarding the leading of a war, and a hybrid war in particular, it was a major failure. This criticism, which publicly, I guess, validated by the regime, so that it shows that they are taking distance. I read very interestingly a very interesting article in the Global Times, in which it was said that the speech by President Putin on the 9th of May, instead of being what had been announced, declaration of war, mobilization, and all that, was something quite reframed. Of course, it doesn't mean that President Putin doesn't have his aims in Ukraine, so he had to back off a bit. But the conclusion of the article was, oh, there is room for maneuvering and for peace. So the Chinese government, in what I see, in what I read, in my view, is seeking paths here or there for peace. Mediation, no, we are not yet so far. Whether it could happen, it's another matter. But there is a strong interest in peace and taking some distance so that the political system continues on, and with this major objective, which is the gathering of the 20th Congress Party Congress, which is the major event in which there will be accountability by the leadership to the rest of the party and the country.
Absolutely. I wonder whether with the current the COVID situation and the questioning of the zero COVID policy, which has been, pretty much between the lines for the past few weeks, is not sort of taking over from foreign policy and relations with the West or relations with Russia in some ways. I mean, at the moment, everything is political. China keeps saying everything is the West or other countries are making things political, but there's no more political regime than the Communist Party of China. Certainly the fact the 20th Party Congress is around the corner is critical. I have two small questions for you on China, or perhaps one question, as you were ambassador for several years in Beijing. A number of foreign companies, and we have various business executives in the audience. The China market was very much, impressive to big companies, and it was very much a matter of hope, really. But recently, the accumulation of problems, when you think about the level playing field, the fact it's been difficult, the competition coming from state-owned enterprises, and this obsession of control from the party. Which is expressed in a way by the zero COVID policy, which is not entirely about health matters, right? That's certainly my view, and that's quite a few people's views as well. But I wanted to ask you how you felt about this comment by Dan Rosen, who was the founding partner of the Rhodium Group. He said, China cannot have both today's statism and yesterday's strong growth rates. It will have to choose. Do you think the fact that the party has been so much in control for the past 10 years, and it looks like it's going to continue, is going to impact or be an impediment to the growth, and whether the current leadership, which very much seems like it's going to continue as the leadership, will accept to have a lower growth and perhaps be less attractive as an economy, just to preserve the power of itself and of the state over the economy and over the whole system.
So it's true that in the last 10 years, most of the credits by Chinese banks have gone to SOEs, to state-owned enterprises, about 70%. And the more the time went, the more these credits were directed, because you can manage, I would say, the figures of employment and unemployment in a proper manner if you are in control of a company which belongs to the state. I guess the Chinese were very pragmatic, and that's what I said, what I saw when I was there. are still trying to find the right balance between the state control and private enterprise and private initiatives. And I read recently that Li Keqiang, the prime minister, who had been put aside for a while, we didn't hear so much about him in the last times, is coming back in a way in the months which are prior to the meeting of the party congress, and trying to loosen a bit more the regulations on foreign companies. Whether it will be effective or not, this is a question which remains open. But there is a feeling by the Chinese that, and I come back to what I said, there is a feeling that one needs another bounce back for growth. The damages, the collateral damages in Chinese economy by COVID, the fact that now the zero COVID policy seems to be not as efficient as it was foreseen, the fact one had to close major towns, Xi'an, Shenzhen, others, and now Shanghai, and Beijing in a way, this is terribly damaging, not only to the image of China, but to the efficiency. It is the rupture of supply chains. I know that automotive industry in Germany has been hit by the closing, by the lockdown in Xi'an for about 15 days. So China has to maneuver and find out other spaces for bouncing back. And if they bounce back, there is employment. If there's employment, population is satisfied. And if population is satisfied, the regime continues on its path. So I think it's very simple. It's like that, very simple. Not simple as a simple with the equation. In the implementation, it's another matter. But I think there is the major difficulty for China will come from another part, which is the societal evolution. My observation in China is that the more you have middle class, which is the success of China, the fact that there are now more than 600 million people who have been lifted out from misery, out from poverty, and there is still a lot to do. About half of the population has still to be to get out of poverty. But the more you have educated people, the more you have people who are demanding, the more you have middle class, and there are about 20 million middle class more every year, the more you have requests and demands from that population. So the more the party must be very accurate and responsive to whatever comes. And I would say the captors of the party are very much at stake. And so when we see this evolution I was mentioning of loosening a bit more cooperation with foreign companies, having taken some measures regarding transfer of technologies and all these things which are at stake during negotiations, it's important to see it. It's part of the global approach we have of China, society, economy, and pragmatism very much.
Thank you. I will now turn to Pierre Aski, who has a question for you, and I understand he's going to appear online. So Pierre, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hello, Maurice. It's always weird to speak in English between French people, but that's the rule of the game. My question was, how much do you think can Europe keep an independent and autonomous path on its relation to China, in relation to the growing confrontation between the US and China? If it comes to a real Cold War between the US and China, can Europe stay on its own course, or will it have to align on the US, whether it wants it or not?
So as you know well, so far, Europe has tried to have its own stance towards China. And this was this definition given of what must be the partnership with China in 2019. It was that we have a systemic rivalry with China. It was that we have a competition issue. And at the same time, that Chinese must remain partners because we need each other. That was on that basis that President Macron at the time invited at the state visit of President Xi Jinping and invited Chancellor Merkel from Germany as well as the president of the Commission, Juncker, at the time. And so that it showed that, yes, the European interests are what they are within that framework I just reminded. Whether we shall be ready to go ahead remains open. Of course, we are under a sanctions regime at the moment. There were these sanctions on the Uyghur issue, the retaliation by China, so we must get out of it. We have signed with China an agreement on a comprehensive agreement on investments, which is key because in this agreement, plenty of issues regarding technologies, transfers, level playing field, and all market access are dealt with. For the moment, it's blocked. It has to be approved by parliaments. The question will be that whether the Americans let us go ahead one day. And what I fear, I will be blunt with you, we are under the umbrella of the US regarding the Ukraine issue. And we are now, we are no longer dependent on Russia, less and less dependent on Russia regarding our energy supply, for which the Americans generously have offered to sell us their gas shell after fracking, which is prohibited in Europe. So we shall import this gas. What I fear is, having known the Iraq war and the tensions of the Iraq war, when you're not aligned with our US friends, with the threats of the US friends on you, on your strategy, on your supplies, and your exports and all that, I fear that one day could come, if Europe is not cautious enough, that if we don't follow the US policy on China, the US administration would tell us, but you want our gas, so please follow the path we are going on. And that's something I fear very much. It's not yet said, maybe it will not happen, but that's a threat we have upon us. We are from one dependence, we have shifted to another dependence to a certain extent, so we have to diversify our sources of supply in Middle East countries, in Northern Africa, regarding energy in particular. But this is a major issue. So yes, we have interest with China. Yes, we must go ahead. Yes, we must be cautious to tell who we are. I am very much saying with the Chinese, the megaphone diplomacy doesn't work. So let's say what we have to say, but in an appropriate manner. We need each other. We need stability. We need prosperity. There is a Chinese market. There is Chinese development. There is our development. We need to work together. When we talk about fragmentation of the world, of rupture of supply chains and all that, there is the rupture of disruption of supply chains regarding technologies. We need to go up in technologies to develop ourselves. And in that field, we are very close to the Chinese. We are working with them as we are working with the Americans. But working with the Americans must not prevent us from going ahead with China within frameworks in which everyone knows what the rules are, how we work together, and we go ahead.
So you seem to be pretty much in agreement with what has been done for the past 5 years under the first term of President Macron. You think he has struck a balance, right? By you mentioned the president inviting Chancellor Merkel and keeping the line open with China, certainly keeping the line open with Russia as well, although not very successfully until now. Could we envisage that France will take the sort of the lead in creating a third way, as some people have alluded to, not under the umbrella of the United States, but certainly not under the umbrella of the authoritarian states?
So to take the lead is very ambitious. We cannot take the lead alone. First and foremost, we must not work against the US, because the US are our allies, are our partners. We cannot work against the US interests. But that doesn't prevent us from working with other partners with which the US have different policies. We are talking about the leadership. So I think that in that way, what I would say is very trivial and very classic, which is that the Germany and France, in that way, have something to say with others, of course, the Italians, the Spaniards, everyone, we have to organize ourselves. But if I remember when I was in Beijing, my contacts with the Chinese authorities, when I was alone, they were receiving me. Okay, France, permanent member of Security Council, what do you have to say? And they listened to me politely. I had done the strategic investments and all these kind of things. I had things to say. I had my instructions. When I came with the Germans, this was different. The listening by officials was, I would say, more dense, more intense, more attentive, because the two countries, France and Germany, were representing 150 million people, let's say 3 good Chinese provinces, which is better than one. We were representing, so politically, France, as it is, permanent member of Security Council, so with an international status, and Germany, the major economic country of Europe. So the gathering of together, representing about the half of the Eurozone, that's as shareholders of the Euro. That was something which was for the Chinese important to listen to. And that's the way we shall go on, because we have our interest, we have our interest to defend, we have our interest to coordinate with others. And I think many of the European countries could follow us in that path, provided there are some preliminary talks before we talk, both of us, French and Germans, to the Chinese government.
Okay, we have quite a lot of questions on the chat, and several from our friend Duncan Clark. And I'm going to take, well, the last one particularly is a bit different. It's on ASEAN. And he mentioned that Peter Pio, one of our speakers, offered the possibility that ASEAN would have a CDC to help to prevent and control future pandemics. It's quite interesting, as you know, Joe Biden recently welcomed the ASEAN leaders in Washington, in fact, a few days ago, and is trying to move to pivot perhaps towards Southeast Asia. The EU is trying to keep a link with ASEAN as well. But obviously, ASEAN has not been as efficient as the EU when it comes to, dealing with the pandemic. But I wonder, and Duncan is asking, can France play a role in facilitating this kind of initiatives that benefit us all?
Asian region is a key region. Southeast Asia as a whole, with an organization, international organization, with countries which are taking some initiatives. I remember in my last years, I used to go on a regular basis to Singapore to discuss, to have an overview. So Southeast Asia is a very, I would say, varied region. You have from Vietnam and Cambodia up to Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia. These are very, Thailand, these are countries which are very diverse, but which are, I would say, in the key region on which we have this Indo-Pacific policy, partly. This is a region where exchange trade represents a lot for the whole exchange in the world. So we talk with them, and all measures which can be taken regarding security, we are part of. There are some dialogues launched in the Shangri-La dialogue, for instance, to which we participate. So whatever can be done by the EU regarding the consolidation of the links we have with that region, with key to the stability of exchange and politics in the region, we are very much in favor, and we work on that.
There are many questions on China, but I'd like you to speak to us a little bit about India, because obviously this is the elephant in the room, if I may say, and there are many elephants in India still. How do you see Indian positioning in the current environment, security environment, vis-à-vis Russia, vis-à-vis what's going on in Ukraine, and in in an Indo-Pacific, because we haven't mentioned that term yet, but where obviously it is surrounded by China's friends, whether it's Myanmar or Pakistan or a few others. And at the same time, it does need the West partnership, but it wants to remain autonomous and certainly in its procurement strategy of acquiring military equipments from Russia, although that may not be for the long term. But how do you see the Modi government's policy, which seems to be shifting a little bit, and that's going back to our earlier points about the West versus the rest, please?
India's policy has become, because of the strength of India, as everyone knows, more and more important in the region. We must go back to the tradition of the non-aligned movement. Let's remember Pandit Nehru's policy, which was always in the third party, on the third path. I would say that Pandit Nehru's policy was animated by some ideals, democratic ideals, which are no longer exactly the same now, though India remains a large democracy, but with some internal problems, with the very activist movement for Hinduism and all that. So it's not exactly the same India we have to deal with. But the policy remains about the same, though I would say on more opportunistic approach. And if we look at India, it's interesting to see that India is a member of the Quad in which you have the US, Australia, and Japan, to talk about the security in the Indo-Pacific region. At the same time, the procurement, as you reminded, for their weapons is largely from Russia, not only, of course, a bit from the US, a bit from France, but largely from Russia. And on the border, on the eastern border of India, there is China. So they have to maneuver with all these neighborhood. If you add to that Pakistan, which has become, from being an ally of the US, has moved to become an ally of China with this corridor on which the Chinese have invested. So India has to maneuver and is opportunistic in its approach. We have close links, of course, of India to the US because of the diaspora in the US. Millions of Indians live there. So it's very mixed. What we see now is that India is keeping distance to the conflict, not condemning Russia, but though it's not very clear, not being completely aside of Ukraine. They have links with Ukraine. India is, I would say, dealing with its own interests at first. If we see what happened the day before yesterday when they decided to ban their exports of grain, as they are a major exporter, it adds to the tensions because they want to preserve their population, which has been deeply hit by the COVID. So this is the position of India, in between, keeping contact with the West and the East, and having in mind a major focus on China, which is the competing power nearby.
There's a question in the chat. I'm going back to China now, but where is China on the usual spectrum of autocracies throughout world history toward stifling of initiative and encouragement of internal corruption? I'm not quite sure what's meant here, but I mean, perhaps the first part of the question is clearer than the second part. Where is China in the spectrum of autocracies? Is there? Is history teaching us anything about China, or is China a standalone autocracy? I wouldn't probably go for that one, but I'd love to hear.
That's an interesting question, because can we put China in a category?
Right.
In my view, China remains apart from everything. China was ignored, totally unknown by the West, by the Romans, by our history until Marco Polo, and then by the Jesuits. That's only from the 16th century onwards that we discovered what China was. And China had no knowledge of the West. We had no knowledge of China. China is apart. China has its own development. it doesn't mean that China cannot know an evolution on certain kind of democracy. Look, I would say China is not improper to democracy. Look at Taiwan. There is a democracy in Taiwan. These are Chinese, and they have developed democracy. So I wouldn't be inclined to systematize, I would say, something on China. China has its own system of development, which has worked very efficiently. Of course, the concept of liberty, the concept of independent judiciary are things which are far away from the Chinese mindset so far. It is an autocracy, it is illiberal. They are trying to take advantage of our weaknesses, of the weakness of our systems. They got together with the Russians because this, I would say, delusion on the democratic powers is great on their side, but I couldn't say more.
There's a question earlier on from Laurent Thérésien. Do you think that during COVID, we have much too many so-called experts in the media commenting on Ukraine, which is creating confusion in people's minds? Of course, none of us is concerned with this question.
You know, that's the result of the system we have in media. We have to get around tables, many different voices. So some are more relevant than others, but that's all. I wouldn't say anything. People are trying their best to explain. Some have their convictions, some have their interests, some is their mixed interests and convictions. So it's very difficult to condemn or to judge the ones who are talking on COVID or on Ukraine. This is the media system as it is.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Samuel Marinelli. Putin has proven to be a master of the game of divide and rule, negotiating with Macron here, keeping in close touch with Berlin there. Europe being an area covering many different countries and cultures, it is not fundamentally disadvantaged in this kind of strategies. Is it not fundamentally disadvantaged? In a word of blocks where economic and demographic volume is the strength, how could Europe turn this weakness into a strength?
So that Putin is a master of rule and divide. That's, I would say, something which we find by many leaders. I would say the Chinese are masters at that as well. How can we react on that? By being united, by discussing, by trying to find out convergences, but starting from interests which are not exactly the same. I was just reminding them at the beginning, when you have sources of energy which are coming from one direction, from another one, and one supplier, another supplier, it's not always, I would say, covering each other. So the only way is to consult. The European Union works not such bad in that sense. I would say the first batch of sanctions, the first 5 ones, have been decided quite quickly. So one needs to have the ones who federate opinions and so that decisions can be made in a unified way to counter the ones in front who want to divide us. But it's a matter of, I would say, physics and chemistry together.
And another quick question from Laurent Thérésien. How do you assess the France losing ground in Africa? I mean, we mentioned President Chirac. Of course, President Chirac had so many polls, and he was certainly very knowledgeable about Africa as well. Do you see France losing ground in favor of Russia and China? Well, in Russia, we know it's kind of, ad hoc, but in the case of China, it's certainly much more of a long-term issue and certainly an economic commitment to Africa.
So whether the expression of losing ground is appropriate, I am not sure, but I would say that we are experiencing, as a former colonial country, I speak in particular Western Africa, we are experiencing a change of generation in our countries, in France, but also in African countries. And so we have to adapt to that. That's the first point. the demands of the Africans now the same as they were 60 years ago. We have to adapt. Second, you mentioned Russia and China, but I would say China, and before Russia, I would say Turkey, I would say Lebanon, I would say India, I would say Japan. There are many other partners of Africa which are working there with African countries. Are we able to manage and work with them? Yes, in a way, we have lost ground. When we look at the level of trade we had with Africa 25 years ago, it has been reduced by half. If we look at the investments, the last investment in harbors was the one of Bolloré Group. They've sold to a Swiss company. So the French are less and less present with investments in Africa. So we have come in a period of reorganization, reset of our relation with Africa. President Macron has that very well in view. This operation Barkhane we have in Sahel region against terrorism, we are withdrawing it and reorganizing it with some other countries. We want the EU to remain involved. The EU could be more involved because the fate of Africa is not only a fate shared with France, but with the whole of the European countries, and in particular Southern European countries. So we must, in the question, I see that yes, there is a need to change the approach to reset it.
We are reaching perhaps the end, but I have to ask you a final question, if I may. This event was titled New Dividing Lines in Asia. Perhaps it's new dividing lines as a whole. And I was wondering, has the Ukraine war somewhat redrawn the geopolitical map and the lines of geopolitics? Or do you still see Asia or the Indo-Pacific, for that matter, as the core region economically and perhaps politically, should China become the superpower it wants to become, and will it? Who knows? So I wonder whether the recent, it's very hard to reflect, obviously, on something that is still going on, which is a terrible war, just a couple of 1,000 kilometers from here. But I wonder if you think this is a turning point.
We are in the middle of the turning point. We are not yet seeing exactly, we cannot gauge yet what will be the consequences. What is for sure is that there is an issue we didn't discuss, which is the grain crisis. The grain crisis will be a major crisis. When you see that 30% of the grain are exported by Ukraine and Russia, that will hit economies and societies in Africa, in the Middle East, in Northern Africa in particular. There is a crisis on vegetable oils, which is something crucial as well. Ukraine is exporting about 60% of vegetable oil used in the world. Indonesia also is hit by all these results. So what can we do in this field? There will be lines of disruptions, which we shall see. And I think most of these countries are trying to find out ways and means to repair this relation with some countries who could provide them supplies and social stability. Now, if we look to the Asian region, there were always great initiatives taken which are not yet come at the end. I think, for instance, of the RCEP, which is a major economic zone which gathers about 30% of the global netto product of the planet. RCEP, which is a replacement of the TPP launched by Obama and made by Trump. These are groups on which we have to look at. There are, in those places, there are initiatives, there are investments, there are technologies. So these are regions on which we have to work. This will be the task of the EU to see how they can work with all these regions. When we see that in this RCEP, there is Australia, there is Japan, there is China. So there are, in fact, apparent contradictions which still don't prevent those countries to work together, from working together. So yes, there will be divides. We are going, whether the globalization is at the end, I wouldn't say so, but reorganization of the whole international trade system, investment system, financial system, new financial circuits, if the crisis is prolonged, this is something which is highly possible. Even if the war knows still stand, when will the sanctions be lifted? That is an open issue. They shouldn't be lifted before Russian troops withdraw from the region they are occupying now, on which they are fighting, where the balance of forces between Russia and Ukraine will stop if there is no, I would say, derailing of the whole situation. There are so many questions open, but for sure there is a disruption, and the world, and it will be after COVID first, which was the first time we saw our dependencies and the need for more self-reliance on certain issues. And now on supply chain and what has happened with the Ukraine war has brought us to a turning point in the history of the continents.
We haven't answered all the questions, apparently. I'm sure there's quite a few remaining. I'm talking in general, not just in the chats, in terms of today's geopolitical situation. But thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for this wonderful chat we've just had. And we've taken 8 more minutes. I hope the Asian Society France will forgive the moderator.